All right, welcome everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to the webinar and learn how to get ISO certified. Before we begin, we're just going to go through a couple housekeeping items. If you're here for CPE credit, please actively respond to all the polling questions and stay on for the duration of the broadcast. If you have technical difficulties, please email us the polling questions with your answers. And if you have any questions or comments, please submit them via chat. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to our moderator today, Morena Tescova, who's going to go through the learning objectives as well as introduce our panel for today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm very pleased to present fantastic speakers today and also discuss a little bit more about a very well-known, very famous framework, ISO. So today you will learn about how to achieve ISO 27001 compliance or certifications, ISO 27701 certifications, and actually what is ISO 27001 or 27701. You would be able also to examine the importance of implementing these standards in your organizations. How are they placed around the world? As well as to identify changes in ISO certifications and data privacy laws. And with that, I'm very pleased to present the speakers today. I will start initially, I will start with Willy. Willy is our guest today. Welcome, Willy. Pleasure to meet you. And thank you very much for joining this webinar. Willy is a certified lead auditor for various ISOs, including ISO 9001, ISO 20000, ISO 27001, ISO 27701, etc. He's also audited significant number of Fortune 500 companies with thousands of audits delivered during his career. I'm pretty sure you will learn more about him from him as well. Another speaker today is a member of our team. This is Nick Meyer. He's a manager with Armanino, who is also one of our key ISO internal auditors. And last but not least is Brian, who is a director within our team at Armanino and leads our ISO internal audit practice. Brian has over 10 years of experience doing information security and ISO related audits, as well as ISO implementations for many of our clients. And with that, Brian, welcome today, and I will let you say a few words about ISO, the practice, your cooperation with Willy. Please go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Morena. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everybody joining in today. I really appreciate your time. You know, time is valuable, and we certainly hope to give you some value out of this next hour. Just to kind of talk a little bit about the genesis of this webinar. So as Morena mentioned, you know, at Armanino, we focus on the ISO internal audit practice, and that's the function and the requirement that we fulfill for a lot of our clients. We've been doing this for about, 10 plus years. Started originally with just a handful of clients, and about 4 or 5 years ago, as our SOC practice took off, we noted a lot of interest in our SOC clients to also get ISO certified, and we saw an intake, an uptick in our own ISO internal audit practice at that point. And it was at that point when we decided we needed to get strategic and find a partner that is an accredited certifier. And so we looked close to home. We looked at Armanino's ISO certifier, who turned out to be BSI, and started conversations with them and found them to be extremely accommodating, not only to us, but to our client base. And not only that, they brought in a lot of credibility, because BSI is the world's largest certifier, ISO certifier, as well as they developed the original information security standard that ISO leveraged in 2005. And so, as I mentioned, those folks at BSI were very accommodating when we talked about, doing some informative webinar for our client base, and potentially joining forces with them. They introduced us to Willy, and Willy we are very thankful and happy to have Willy on board today. Willy's a leading expert. He's the head of InfoSec and experience in privacy and BCPDR at ISO. He's been doing this for 25 plus years, so he knows everything ISO. and or almost everything ISO. And we're happy to have him, and I'm happy to have him kind of lead into this this webinar and discuss, the basics of what is ISO, what is a management system, and how would my company get ISO certified. And so, Willy, with that, will you please take us into ISO?
Sure. Brian, thank you very much for this kind words. Really appreciate it. Yes, 25 years in the business. Wow, that dates me. So just in case you're wondering, I started immediately after kindergarten or so. No, just kidding. So yeah, I started ISO technically while I was still studying computer science. So my thesis was benefiting a stamping facility in Germany. And those guys were looking for somebody helping them with the implementation of an ISO 9001 management system, so quality management system. And that exposed me to ISO the very first time. I got the organization certified, and then moved to the other side of the table, went for one of the certification bodies for 3 years to Johannesburg, South Africa. And then after 3 years, I moved to Chicago, where I'm located for the last 21 years, and various roles and responsibilities within BSI. So I started as a client manager, as an auditor, and then sooner or later, I find myself getting trained to British Standard 7799, which was the predecessor to ISO 27001. And then started auditing to this standard. And well, the rest is history, as they say, right? So as Brian already said, I'm the global head for information security, privacy, and business continuity at BSI. And British Standard Institution is the national standardization body of the UK, representing the UK at Geneva, at ISO in Geneva, and helping to develop and publish international standards. And that brings us to this slide that we all see right now. So who and what is ISO? Well, ISO stands for International Organization for Standardization. And now you say, just hold on, that's not ISO, that's iOS. But why is it called ISO versus iOS? Well, ISO is actually a word. And it stems from the Greek word isos, which stands for equal, the same. And that's what standards are really all about. Standards are about making sure that things are the same, are defined. So just imagine you are thinking about a screw and a nut. And yes, you need to have a defined diameter for the screw matching the nut. You need to have the defined thread parameters defined, otherwise the screw will not fit the nut. And that's fundamentally the idea of standards, making sure that around the world we are talking the same language. And ISO is comprised of 165 member organizations from around the world. There are only a very, very few countries that are not members of ISO for a variety of reasons. But generically speaking, every country in the world is represented. And those ISO standards are very diverse. They can be very technical, as I mentioned already earlier, from screws, bolts, and nuts, to steel properties and steel alloys definition, but also in the management system world, addressing concepts like quality management system, environmental management system, and in our world, information security and business continuity. And it's interesting to note, I don't want to put myself into a pedestal because, frankly speaking, I had nothing to do with it. But all of those ISO standards mentioned, ISO 27, ISO 22301, ISO 14001, ISO 9001, are based originally on British standards. British Standard Institution has been on the forefront of developing standards for more than 120 years. And the very first standard we actually published was related to the gauge track width of London's trams. And one can only imagine how challenging it would be to ride a subway or a tram if the gauge tracks would be different from village to village, from suburb to suburb. So ISO is an independent organization, non-governmental, based on income, is based on the fees that people pay for buying the standards. So just in case you're wondering, why are those standards so expensive? Well, one reason is that obviously, if we buy the standards, that somehow then obviously supports the development of those standards. And that's pretty much everything about ISO. If you want to have more information, by all means, please reach out to me after the webinar, and I'm more than happy to discuss further. Now, in the next couple of slides, I would like to go very, very quickly over the ISO certification process. And this ISO certification process is independent of the management system that is getting certified. So I mentioned earlier quality management, environmental management, right? And whether it's these standards or whether it's ISO 27001 or ISO 27701 or ISO 22301, it doesn't matter. The certification process is always the very, very same. And we just try to describe it in 10 steps. And guess what? The very first important step is buy the standard, because believe it or not, when auditors come on site, they really would like to see that the organization has a copy of the standard, because if you don't have the copy of the standard, how would you be able to implement the requirements, right? How would you even know whether this is suitable for the organization or not? Then after you have purchased the standard and digested the content, as a second step, obviously, you would then need to contact a partner, e.g. a certification body. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. That is then helping you to go through the process and help you to understand what are the necessary steps. Because each organization is different. There can be no cookie cutter, but this very step is extremely important. So please select your partner for this endeavor very, very careful. Step number 3 is filing an application with the selected certification body, where the certification body, for example, BSI, would ask some fundamental questions like how many people, how many locations, what kind of products, what kind of industry are you in, what is the desired scope of certification. And this is extremely important, because if we don't know the scope, then we cannot really talk about the necessary effort. So scope is very important. So that third step is very crucial. The next step, number 4, is about the certification process. And please, please, please make sure that you have the necessary skills and tools. There is a wide range of workshops and seminars available. Training for internal people is available to really understand what is ISO all about. ISO is not rocket science, but that said, an ISO project is not getting done over the weekend. Let's be honest. It's not like you go to a website, fill out an application, furnish your credit card information, and 24 hours later you get a certificate. It's not going to work like that. There's work involved. There is hard work involved. But on the other hand, don't be scared. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of organizations around the globe have done so, and we will come back to that at a later time. Then the 5th step is about ensuring that the assessment team is appointed. Obviously, that's the responsibility of the certification body. So once BSI or the certification body of your choosing has reviewed the application, has provided you with a quote, and the organization has accepted the quote, then the certification body needs to appoint the project lead, the lead auditors, making sure that indeed there is a suitable match. While I personally have been auditing organizations in the automobile industry, in the plastic injection industry, things like that, I would not feel comfortable to audit a company that manufactures medical devices, because frankly speaking, that's not my forte, and that's okay. You know, at the end of the day, auditors have, as everybody, their specialties, and those specialties need to be matched. Otherwise, an audit will be not very successful, and it will be only leading to significant issues later down the road. So the appointment of the audit team is a very crucial step, which brings me then to step number 6, which is an optional step. I need to emphasize that, which is called the gap analysis. The gap analysis, some organizations, some people call that also a pre-audit. This gap analysis is really about identifying potential issues. It has no bearing whatsoever on the certification process of the organization. However, gives a very, very good indication whether the organization is on the right track. But I really would like to emphasize that as a certification body, BSI cannot and must not consult. That's really the responsibility of consultants. But BSI can help organizations identify gaps. And frankly speaking, this gap assessment helps organizations to, well, meet their auditor, and frankly speaking, help the auditor to meet the company. Because at the end of the day, it's a business of people. And therefore, it's really, really important that both parties, the auditors, as well as the client, the organization that seeks certification, know each other quite well. So that gap assessment has also that purpose, but we are not really stating that. It's really about identifying potential gaps. The next step, step number 7, is a requirement, and this is what we call the stage 1 review. During the stage 1 review, the audit team will verify that indeed the proposed time is adequate and sufficient, that the scope makes sense, and make sure that the required documentation is in place. Auditors would not necessarily verify if those documentations provided are indeed correct and are executed correctly. It's more about, do you have a procedure? Do you have a policy? Rather than, let's verify that the procedure is indeed lived. That is the kind of stuff that is getting done in the stage 2. So step 8, where we are talking about the stage 2, which is what I call the Big Bang audit. That's the kind of stuff that's the kind of audit where auditors go to the organization in great detail, analyzing every single requirement and verify that the requirements are being fulfilled. So now it's not just, do you have a procedure for work from home? Do you have a procedure for mobile devices? Now the question is, so your procedure for mobile devices says that a particular level of OS needs to be installed on those devices. Show me that you actually are controlling that. What kind of process do you have in place to ensure that the requirements from your procedures have been implemented? And then that brings us to step number 9, that is achieving certification. So after successful stage 1 and stage 2, the auditors will then recommend the organization for certification. And then an independent certification body within BSI, so we call that technical review. Other organizations may call that QA, doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But a person independent of the auditors is then verifying the entire project, from, is the quote adequate? Is the quote signed with the right entity? Was the stage 1 done? Is the stage 2 done? Are the auditors coming to the conclusion that the organization can be certified? If everything is fine, is great, then the certificate is getting issued. And certificates are valid for 3 years from the date of a review and approval. Now, that's the time where the organization usually must celebrate. And I highly recommend to have a bottle of champagne available for that particular date. when the organization gets the certificate. But that celebration should be only last one day. After that, I believe the real hard work only starts, which brings me to the last and final step, and that is making excellence a habit. You know, getting certified is, relatively speaking, easy. Keeping the certification is actually hard work. And many organizations underestimate the efforts necessary to maintain certifications. In my career, I have seen it so many times. You go in, certification audit is getting done, everybody celebrates. You come back for the first surveillance audit, for the second surveillance audit. There are a couple of issues, nothing serious. As auditor, you identify those issues as non-conformances. The organization puts some kind of patchwork on it, and things done, right? Well, comes the recertification audit 3 years later. The person who originally implemented the system is no longer there, and the system is just collapsing, and the certificate is gone. So please make sure that this is not going to happen. And that then brings me to the next slide. Marinda.
Thank you very much, Willy, for these insightful comments about ISO, and especially for the maintenance of the certification. Extremely important, I agree. Also, thank you very much for all your questions. I see a lot of questions in the chat. We will make sure that we have a few minutes left at the end of the webinar so we can walk through all of the questions. If for some reason we cannot answer all of them, we will answer separately and personally to each one of you. And having said that, one of you mentioned that he doesn't see a questions. The polling questions are already here. First question is, what do you consider to be the top reasons to obtain an ISO certification for your organization? Customers, competitive advantage or credibility, implement a proper information security management system, adherence to data privacy regulations, or none of the above? I will just give 1 minute to answer these questions, and I'm very curious to see the results. Please vote. Let's see the results now. Competitive advantage or credibility is gaining momentum here. 28% believe that this is their top reasons to obtain an ISO certification. 26% think that they would like to implement a proper information security management system, and ISO will support that. 23% is about the adherence to data privacy regulations. Very interesting. We will speak a little bit more about privacy and ISO later. And customers, of course, customers matter. I'm personally very curious to learn from those who said none of the above, if there is any other reason on the basis of which they would like to consider ISO certification. Please mention it in the chat. Thank you. Thank you very much. Some people say all of the above. Yes, I agree. Next slide, and polling question number 2. Polling question number 2 would be, what do you consider to be the largest hurdle to obtaining ISO certification? Executive support or buy-in, ensuring proper program oversight, implementing technical controls, monitoring control effectiveness, or other, none of the above? Again, 1 minute for response. Please vote. Christine, if the results are ready, happy to see the results. 29% are saying that the biggest hurdle is monitoring control effectiveness, which very much aligns with what Willy said in the beginning. Then we have 24% saying ensuring proper program oversight. Totally agree. Executive support or buy-in, and again, other, none of the above. Thank you very much. Next, I'm very excited to talk about ISO 27000. We learned some general information about ISO. Now we are getting into the information security aspects of ISO. And Nick and Brian will tell us a little bit more about the information security family of standards, ISO 27000. Having said that, Brian will tell us what is a family of standards, which is very unique to ISO. Brian. Nick,
I think Nick's going to take this one.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thanks, Brian. I'll actually jump in here. Wanted to touch on something that Willy mentioned earlier. I think now is a good time to kind of demystify a lot of the standards here, right? We're seeing a lot of numbers here. It can be confusing. So, Willy mentioned in his intro that there's a lot of different standards that make up the ISO family of standards as a whole. But what does a family of standards mean, right? So when we're talking specifically for this conversation about information security, 27,000 is the family of standards relating to controls used to improve and enhance information security processes at an organization. So 27,000 is the family of information security controls. And then if we get a little bit more granular, 27,001, as you can see on this slide, is the entry-level requirements for that standard. So these are the entity-level controls used to guide an organization to implement, enhance, and continually improve their information security management system. We'll talk about that a little bit in future slides. And then as we get a little bit more granular, there's an additional standard, 27,002, which is kind of coupled with 27,001. These include an Annex A of technical and non-technical controls across a wide variety of areas in an organization that kind of covers the gambit of information security across an organization. So one thing I want to note is that not all of these controls are required, and we'll talk about that in a future slide.
Yeah, and I'll just add here, if you wouldn't mind going back one slide, just to piggyback off of what Nick said and what Willy had said previously. If you know, the family of standards will always end in 00, and in this case, 27,000 is everything information security related. So 27,000 is the information security family of standards. The 01 is always focused on the management system. That is the program that you are implementing. So in this case, if you wouldn't mind going forward, the 27,001 standard is regarding the information security management system. Right, and ISO in all its uniformity and wisdom has really unified or basically made standardized the management system, the 01 standards. So 27,001, 9,001, they all reference the same clauses you see in the middle of the slide here. Right, these are the same various areas that are required to properly design and implement any program, if you will. And just in this case, it's the information security program or information security management system, also referred to as the ISMS. That's ISO nomenclature, ISMS, you'll hear. So what's important about the ISMS clauses? It takes you, as I mentioned, through the life cycle of any quality program, starting with defining your scope and objectives. Where does my organization, my program sit in the context of the organization, as you see in the top left corner? Defining your scope is essential, right? The first step, is your scope going to be the entire company, or is your scope going to be a particular customer-facing platform? And that's going to determine, the amount of information that you're going to scope in for your ISO. That's going to determine the number of systems that you're going to scope in for your ISO. It's going to determine the number of employees that are involved with your ISO certification. And ultimately, it's going to dictate the number of risks that you need to look at for your ISO certification and for your company, right? And that moves into the planning phase. Really, on the right hand is performing a risk assessment, and not just a check the box risk assessment, right? ISO really requires management continuously looking at risk and continuously evaluating. Have we captured the complete list of information security risks, right? Because it's only when you are comfortable that you have at least an idea of the completeness of risk is when you're able to properly treat those risks with controls. And that's what ISO refers to as your risk treatment plan. And so once you have that defined risk treatment plan, then you start implementing controls, right? And then you move into the operation tile there in the middle, right? And then once you have your controls operating, now it's about evaluating the effectiveness of those controls, right? And that's where the internal audit requirement sits, actually. That's why I have a job, is that performance evaluation tile there. But what is management doing, aside from internal audit, but what is management doing to evaluate and monitor the effectiveness of all its information security controls? And then taking that feedback and improving the organization, improving the strength of the controls, identifying control gaps or new risks, and putting controls in place to mitigate those risks, or just getting more efficient, right? That is the life cycle, the intent behind the 27001 standard and just the management system standards in general. Willy, do you have any thoughts to add?
Other than saying that there is a reason why these areas identified here are common between management system standards. The reason being is it's based on what is called the high-level structure of ISO management system standards. And the idea is that it's really about the organization. It's not about ISO. In other words, once an organization has been certified to a management system, for example, ISO 27001 information security, it's very, very easy to also get certified to ISO 14000, the environmental management system, and vice versa. If an organization has been already certified to ISO 9000, getting certified to ISO 27001 is relatively speaking simple because, well, all those core clauses are the same. Are there differences? Yes, of course. I mean, the risk related to producing bad tires is different than the risk to lose the drawing for those tires, right? So there's obviously a difference, but fundamentally, management systems are structured in exactly the same way, regardless of the theme, regardless whether it's information security or privacy or whether it's business continuity.
Right. Yeah. And the way we like to think of it is the 27001 standard is really entity level focused or program governance level controls. And it does reference in the Annex A, leading into the next slide, the Annex A, the technical or non-technical controls that are required. And Nick, you want to take us through the 27002 framework?
Yeah, absolutely. Wanted to touch really quickly on that feedback loop that Brian mentioned in the previous slide of the planning and the evaluation and the continual improvement that's required of the 27001 standard and those clauses. That's what's really going to drive your organization's determination of the controls that need to be implemented. So if we think about the risk assessment process, that's going to help you identify your risks. You're going to identify the risks, address them using your risk management approach, and identify the controls that need to be implemented to address those risks. And as Brian mentioned, that's really a continual process that needs to happen regularly. It's not a one-time thing. And so as we get into 27002, these are the specific controls relating to information security that the standard lays out. There's 114 controls listed in the Annex A of the 27002 standard, and they span 14 different clauses or 14 different areas. As you can see in this wheel, it's pretty broad. We've got human resources security, asset management, physical security. It really covers the whole gambit of any area that an organization may need to consider information security. And these will not all be applicable for every business and for every business model. When you look at the 114 controls in the Annex A of this standard, one of the required documents when you're implementing your information security management system and preparing for the certification is a statement of applicability. So you would, as part of your risk assessment and risk treatment plan, you review these controls as well as any additional controls that your organization might have relating to information security, and determine which are applicable to your business and which may not be applicable. And that all gets rolled up into your statement of applicability. So, as Brian mentioned, this needs to be continuously reevaluated as part of the regular risk assessment process. And controls may be implemented outside of the standard, right? It's good to note that these are suggested controls. The 114 are suggested kind of basic controls across these areas, but you're certainly able to implement and rely on controls outside of the standard as long as they meet the requirements of both the standard and your organization's information security management system.
Yes, that's true. And I also would like to emphasize there is a requirement in the standard that explicitly says that Annex A controls, the exclusion or the inclusion of those controls needs to be justified in the statement of applicability. And justification is not saying we don't want to do it. Justification would need to come from the result of the risk assessment. So while it is correct that not all of those controls from Annex A need to be implemented based upon the result of the risk assessment, the statement of applicability still needs to address those, whether implemented or not, and justify their inclusions or their exclusions.
Yeah, it's a great thing to note. Thanks, Willy.
And I'll just add before we scare off people from potentially getting ISO certified that there's 114 controls. Not all those are technical controls. They cover all the technical areas, many of which are policy related, right? And ensuring management has the right policies implemented. So it's not as daunting in many organizations as it might be in more sophisticated enterprises.
And to add on to that, Brian, you're totally right. Something that we see a lot of the time as ISO implementers and internal auditors is that a lot of these controls can be covered by some of the same processes and the same documentation. So it's not 114 plus different policies necessarily or different processes that need to be implemented. It's they're just covering the bases, and that they can all roll up. Many of them can roll up into a single process or policy document. All right, you can go to the next slide. And so I think this slide,
Mirena's on mute, I think.
I want to pass this off to Willy. I think he's.
No, Mirena is back. She's on mute, but she's still here. Thank you so much, Nick. I'm very happy to actually see this slide. It's an extremely interesting slide that shows the popularity of the standards around the world. And Willy, please let us know a little bit more about that and what happened here that there is such a significant increase.
Yes, frankly speaking, I was shocked when I saw the data some couple of months ago. So I queried our data guys and said, so just out of curiosity, how many certificates did we have 5 years ago, 8 years ago? And obviously, as the data guys are, they came up with, well, the last 20 years or so with data. And then we put that on a map. And yes, I was very surprised to see the growth, especially in the last couple of years, that is displayed here in this slide in various countries and various regions of the world. And what we do see is that there are that the different regions, the different countries of the world have different maturity levels and progress at different rates, right? So can we play again, please? Yes. So we see that obviously China is very active later on, but it also in Asia, Japan is obviously leading. Then sooner or later we see that India is coming up. And yes, it's not a mistake. We do have clients in Greenland as well, and in New Zealand and in Hawaii. So that is telling me that organizations around the globe are interested in protecting the information under their jurisdiction. And this also allows me to answer a question I saw in the chat in terms of is it beneficial, or what would be the benefits for non-for-profit organizations to be certified to 27? And I think this is a very interesting question, an important question actually, because it's really independent what the organization is doing. Every organization has information. Every organization has information about their employees, their customers, their suppliers, their intellectual property, and that information needs to be protected. And when you are, let's say, a non-for-profit organization, let's say you are a sheltered workshop helping handicapped adults finding a job, yes, you are non-for-profit, but at the same time, you still have to protect the information of your employees. You still need to protect financial records. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by having an information security management system in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And having said that and mentioning ISO, we also actually have other huge demand actually for other standards. And we talk about here SOC. I would very much appreciate if Brian can give us a little bit of information about why ISO or why SOC.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as I mentioned, our internal audit, ISO internal audit practice really grew as our SOC practice, more specifically our SOC 2 practice grew. And that's because of customer demands for our clients, right? Their customers are coming to them saying, do you have a SOC 2 or do you have an ISO certification? And so that's driven the SOC 2 practice and, also the ISO practice. And it makes sense. And for a lot of reasons, a lot of our customers are now trying to get both, right? Because there is such an overlap in the controls that Nick went through. There's an overlap between the frameworks of about 70–80%, right? It's almost one-for-one mapping. And for customers with clients with global operations or global customers, ISO kind of speaks more volumes internationally than SOC 2. SOC 2 is an AICPA standard. It's got a lot of notoriety, specifically domestically, though, right? But the keynote here is there's not a considerable level of effort if you have a SOC 2 to also achieve an ISO certification. The primary difference is the 27001 clauses that I went through, the program governance level controls, which if you're achieving a SOC 2, you're probably already performing some of those functions. It's just a matter of formally documenting. And if you have maybe missing some of those controls, they're much easier in most cases to implement than more technical controls. So again, bottom line, if you have a SOC 2 and you have interest in ISO, the level of effort, there's a lot of efficiencies to be gained, and the level of effort it's probably not as much as you think.
Thank you very much. And time for polling questions. Polling question number 3 is, what certifications do your customers or partners request the most? Kristin will launch the question just now so we can see the possible answers. While Kristin is launching the polling question number 3, I will just mention the answers. One is ISO 27001. Another one is Service Organization Controls Report, SOC 2, ISO 27701, SOC 2, or ISO 27001 or other. Do you guys see the question? Because some people see the question, some other people don't see the question.
I think we just displayed the results.
Wonderful. Because I cannot see the results for some reason. So Brian, please comment on the results since you see them.
Yep. So the results looks like either SOC 2 or ISO 27001. Going back to my last slide, the customers are saying they want to see some sort of information security standard in place. Now, depending on whether that customer is in India or Europe, or they're here domestically in the US, they may want to see an ISO versus a SOC 2.
Okay, wonderful. So next question, and again, if I don't see the results, Brian, please feel free to jump in. I see also some of the members of the audience don't see the questions. Apologies for that technical difficulties. In any case, I will read the question for you so you know what the question is, and please feel free to respond in the chat if you cannot vote. The second question is actually a very important question because it's a multiple choice question, and it is with which of the following ISO standards is your organization certified? Select all that apply. Question, answer number 1, ISO 9001 Quality Management System, ISO 27001 Information Security Management, ISO 27701 Privacy Information Management System, and ISO 14001 Environmental Management System. Please, Kristen, release the results when they're ready. We still have another 3 answers, ISO 45001, ISO 22301, or none, not sure.
So we have the results, Marina. It looks like ISO 27001 wins out with a quality management system, which is actually, Willy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's the most popular ISO standard, certified standard.
Absolutely correct. ISO 9001 is, and this is, I know, not necessarily politically correct, but that's the mother of all quality management systems. I know it's not necessarily gender neutral, but that's the standard which started the whole thing in terms of management systems.
Yeah.
So it's not surprisingly to see that this number is pretty high. But considering the audience and where the audience is coming from, I'm also not surprised to see that 27001 is very high. What is a little bit surprising to me is to see 27701, the privacy management system, already being there that high. That's very good, very encouraging, because that standard was only launched, published, I believe, in June, July 2019. So maybe just 2 years ago, published. So within 2 years, seeing a lot of interest in this area is indeed very encouraging. And from an BSI perspective, I can tell you that last year we had delivered more than 1,000 audit days for this standard globally.
Thank you very much, Willy. If we start with the next slide, in continuance to your comments, GDPR, which is the European General Data Protection Regulation, triggered a lot of changes worldwide, including in relation to standards. And I think this is the right time for us to talk about ISO 27701, which has a lot of commonalities with the GDPR. Brian, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, 27701 is in the 27,000 family of standards. Actually, can you go back one slide? Thank you. But it's essentially, and it is another 01 standard. It's another management system standard, right? This covers the privacy information management system, but it is designed to be an extension of your information security management system, your ISMS. So your ISMS and your PIMs go together. Which that triangle kind of depicts, right? So, ultimately, the standard is really designed to help you manage information security and any data privacy regulations that are involved with your business. However, they do actually provide a mapping in the Annex D section of the standard that shows how the clauses within the standard map to the articles in GDPR. Now, that's really for illustrative purposes. It's not really meant to say if you achieve 27701 certification, you achieve GDPR compliance, but it is to show how the structure of the management system and the PIMs can help you achieve any data privacy regulations. And then, really kind of going back, if you thumb through the standard, what you identify is really there's only a couple of unique sections. Most of the references refer back to 27001 and back to 27002. There's only two unique clauses, and those are privacy requirements for PII or data controllers and PII processors, and these are very key concepts in privacy, as well as PII principal or data subjects. And Morena, being our leader in our privacy practice, would you kind of give us a high level description of what those terms mean?
Thank you very much. Actually, this is extremely important from various aspects. I receive a lot of questions from clients and potential clients about we would like to be GDPR certified, which which is a very interesting concept at the moment. But ISO definitely could be used and follows the requirements of the GDPR. There are certain differences in terms of terminology. For example, you can see here PII, which is personal identifiable information. GDPR has another term which you can learn about called personal data, or also you can hear about principals. Principals under the GDPR data subjects are also basically each one of us, the individuals. Controller and processor are well-known concepts. They exist also in the GDPR, and it's basically controller is the entity that kind of make the decision what will happen with the personal data, whereas the processor is the entity on whose behalf it processes personal data on behalf of the controller, to be more precise. In other words, you will see in this standard a lot of GDPR references, which is one significant benefit for these ISO standards. And with that, I will continue with another polling question, unless I'm challenged.
I do have a couple more comments. So just to briefly go back, as I mentioned, there's just really two unique clauses, and ISO, and its uniformity has broken both of those clauses down into four common sections, as you see here before. And just to briefly run through these, right? Conditions for collection and processing. This is really about establishing your lawful basis for collecting data or processing data, right? And also, how developing a process for your data, your PII principals or your data subjects to obtain consent from them to collect their data. Obligations to PII principals. This is, how do you respond to requests to withdraw consent or erase data, right? That's what that topic covers. Privacy by design and privacy by default. This is really about building out your processes with an air of conservatism and limiting the data you collect to just what you need for your business purpose. And then lastly, Morena will speak more to this because there's some changes involved here, but PII sharing, transfer, and disclosure. This is really about, what happens when you transfer data across jurisdictions, what happens when you disclose data to third parties. That's good.
Thank you very much, Brian. Again, unless I'm challenged with the polling question number 5, the question number 5 would be, what other ISO certifications are you interested in learning about? ISO 9001, ISO 27701, ISO 14000, ISO 45001, ISO 22301, or not sure. Christine, please show the results, and Brian, please comment on these results.
All right, we have the results. So number 1 is none, not sure. Number 2 is 27701. So yeah, that aligns with a lot of our customer base. SOC 2 clients or others are thinking about privacy. And that's a number 1 concern. So 27701, the Privacy Information Management System certification, pretty much wins out outside of none and not sure.
Thank you very much. And because we have a very little time left, for 1 minute, we will basically talk about the changes in the ISO standards and privacy developments, and then we will leave 2-3 minutes for answering 1 or 2 questions. If we cannot, for some reason, answer all your questions, I want to assure you that we will answer all your questions separately via email. Thank you so much. So about the changes in the ISO standards, I see that
Marina, we have one more polling question, I think. Sorry. The polling
Okay.
question 6. Can you
All
see
right.
that?
Yes. No. Okay. Here we are. All right. In relation to the polling question number 6, it's which framework do you prefer to use to verify your third party's privacy compliance? ISO 27701, National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. I'm focused on specific laws such as GDPR and CCPA or other. Brian, please feel free to comment on the results.
Absolutely.
Since I don't see the results, guys.
Technical difficulties. So it says I am focused on specific laws such as GDPR and CCPA, which again kind of rings true. And then the second place is ISO 27701. So
of course,
a lot of data privacy concerns out there.
And more to come, and more to come. As I said, in relation to the changes in the ISO standards, Willy, if you can just bring 1-2 comments about that, so then we can proceed with the questions.
Sure. Well, ISO standard development is a constant and ongoing process. While there is obviously a date a particular standard is published, that doesn't mean that that standard is now there forever and will not change. So yes, they are constantly changing in the ISO world. So for example, we do expect a change to ISO 27002 very soon, which obviously will have an impact on ISO 27001 because of the Annex A connection. But we also know that there is a review of ISO 28000 taking place at the moment. ISO 28000 is supply chain security. And with all the supply chain challenges and issues and problems we have heard in the last couple of days, weeks, and months, that's not a surprise that the standard is getting revamped and updated. But we also know that there is an ISO 42001 under development addressing a management system for artificial intelligence. So in other words, ISO is a very agile organization that creates on a regular basis new standards, and please stay tuned for standards that might be of interest to yourself and your organization.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, in relation to the comment of Brian about data transfers, please know that there are new standard contractual clauses for data transfers after the invalidation of the Privacy Shield that actually support the transfers from Europe to United States. There was also a lot of questions about the standard contractual clauses, and here we are. There are changes, there are new standard contractual clauses, some of them related to transfers, some of them in relation to Article 28 of the GDPR. In red, you can see some dates of when you can start using them or when you must start using them. And with that, I will start with just 1 or 2 questions that I received in the beginning of this wonderful discussion. What would be the benefits for a non-profit to hold ISO is something that I believe Willy already responded. But for example, what is the average cost of a ISO 27001 assessment was another question.
Yeah. I take that. That's actually a very difficult question to answer because there are so many variables. So what is the scope of the organization, how many locations, how many people are involved? But I would like to emphasize that the cost of implementation is usually way higher than the cost of certification. Because the organization obviously needs to implement the system, needs to make sure that the adequate controls are in place, needs to make sure that people are adequately trained and the training is getting updated. Which is obviously a cost. We cannot neglect that. But then there is obviously also the certification cost, which is relatively speaking minute compared to the internal cost.
And one last question, and then we will need to end this webinar. And is it common for law firms to invest and become ISO certified? If
yes.
So, which standard?
Yes, ISO 27001 is a standard we have seen many law firms being certified to.
Thank you very much. There are more questions. We will respond to each of you separately. In having said that, please feel free to contact us by using email or get in touch with us in LinkedIn. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. Again, apologies for some technical difficulties we managed. Again, thank you, and we look forward